Hello everyone, I hope you're having a great day. Today, we're going to explore a quiet but powerful moment, a night inside a small woodworking shop where a young owner doesn't celebrate success with money, but with the people who never walked away when everything almost collapsed. This is the story of a leader who says, "I'm not rich, I'm not strong, but I'm proud to work with these people." If you enjoy stories about loyalty, resilience, and real leadership, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next videos. Evening settled slowly over the woodwork shop, as if the light itself were tired after a long day alongside the people. The final buzz of the saw faded away, leaving behind a rare stillness. Only the scent of fresh wood, sawdust lingering in the air, and beads of sweat not yet dry on the workers' backs. Yellow lights were temporarily hung from the crossbeams above, unevenly spaced, some bulbs glowing brightly, others casting only a faint halo, but together they created a strangely warm atmosphere. It was a warmth that came not from luxury, but from familiarity. Since late afternoon, a few younger workers had begun arranging thick wooden planks into a long table. No one needed to give instructions. One person brought chairs, another cleared a corner of the workshop. Someone else wiped away oil stains still smeared across the wood surface. Everything was simple, even a bit clumsy, yet filled with rare attentiveness. The food laid out was modest. A few trays of grilled meat still steaming, a pot of white rice brought from someone's home, crates of beer tucked beneath the table, mixed with soft drinks for those who couldn't drink alcohol. There were no tablecloths, no flowers, only scratches on the wooden surface, marks left behind by hundreds of days of labor. The workers gradually took their seats. Every face bore the weight of exhaustion after a long day, frayed shoulders, calloused hands. Some laughed loudly, sharing stories about cutting a plank wrong that day or complaining about the old saw that always jammed. Others quietly cracked open a beer, took a small sip, and looked around with a mix of curiosity and restraint. They didn't quite know why this gathering was happening. The workshop had always been accustomed to frugality, even hardship, so a meal like this, however simple, was still something unusual. At the far end, near the workshop entrance, James stood leaning against a large wooden pillar. He didn't join in the preparations, nor did he rush forward. The yellow light brushed across his face, revealing traces of fatigue he hadn't managed to hide. He observed each person in turn, from the longtime workers who had been with the shop since the very beginning, to the newer faces still adjusting to the rhythm of the work. In James's mind surfaced memories of the days when the workshop had nearly run out of orders, of evenings spent alone calculating every expense, every paycheck, trying to ensure that no one would be left behind. This gathering was not meant to celebrate a great success, nor was it a display of pride. It came from a simple yet heavy truth. James understood that without the people sitting there, this workshop would no longer exist. They had stayed when everything was at its most uncertain, had chosen to believe in a young owner who had nothing in his hands but stubbornness and promises. James stood there breathing in the familiar scent of wood, waiting for the right moment. As the laughter and conversation slowly blended together, as the distance between everyone naturally began to close, he knew he was about to step forward, to say what he had been carrying in his heart all this time. The atmosphere in the workshop gradually became something else once everyone had taken their seats around the long wooden table. There were no longer any boundaries between veterans and newcomers, between master craftsmen and helpers. Everyone sat close together, shoulders touching, just as they had so often stood side by side beside the old machines for months on end. Beer cans were popped open, the sharp hiss ringing out crisply and blending with laughter released after a day of heavy labor. Some raised their cans high, others simply smiled and took a small sip, but the tension in everyone's eyes had softened compared to usual. Small stories began to travel along the length of the table. Stories about a rainy day when water leaked into the workshop and the whole group had hurriedly propped up planks to save a pile of untreated wood. Stories about the old saw that was louder than any human voice, which once seemed on the verge of dying completely, yet somehow kept running for a few more months. Laughter broke out when someone recalled the night the entire workshop had worked by flashlight during a power outage, each person in a corner, working and worrying at the same time. Those memories no longer felt as heavy as they once had, because now, when retold, they became shared stories, binding everyone together through the feeling that they had endured a difficult stretch side by side. Someone quietly mentioned the hardest days, when the workshop was at its most desperate, when orders were nearly non-existent, when wages sometimes had to be paid late. There was no blame in the story, only a gentle shake of the head accompanied by a bittersweet smile. Back then, it felt like the shop was about to shut down, one person said, half joking, half serious. Another added, "And yet here we are, still sitting here eating together." The whole table laughed, not loudly, but warmly, as if everyone understood just how fortunate they were to still be sitting next to one another at this moment. James moved slowly along the table, quiet and unassuming. He didn't say much, just bent down to pour more beer for one person, placed a tray of grilled meat in front of another. At times, he paused to ask softly if anyone wanted more food, then turned to bring over rice from the corner of the workshop. His movements weren't awkward, but they also carried none of the showiness of a boss trying to make an impression. They were simply natural, the gestures of someone accustomed to standing in the same line as everyone else, to sharing the same space, the same scent of wood and sweat. A few workers glanced at him, a flicker of surprise crossing their faces, then looked back down at their food, as if what James was doing felt right and didn't need to be spoken about. As the food nearly ran out, as the stories began to repeat themselves and the laughter softened, the pace of the workshop suddenly slowed. Voices dropped, beer cans were set down on the table. James stopped at the head of the table and stood still for a few seconds. The yellow light fell on his hands, where traces of sawdust still clung, not yet brushed away. He took a deep breath, as if gathering all the thoughts in his mind. There was no microphone, no stage, just a small open space between him and the people sitting before him. James stood up. The chair behind him let out a faint sound as it was pushed back. A few people lifted their heads to look, and the remaining fragments of conversation gradually faded away. Silence spread naturally, without awkwardness, like a shared instinct. James looked around, his gaze sincere, slightly hesitant, like someone about to say something important but not accustomed to standing before so many people. In that moment, the workshop became strangely quiet, filled only with the slow turning of the ceiling fan and the steady breathing of those waiting. This was when James knew he could no longer remain just an observer. He had to speak. James stood still for a few more seconds, as if to make sure the silence in front of him was real, not just a passing coincidence. He lifted a hand and lightly scratched the back of his neck, his fingers leaving a faint streak of sawdust against his skin. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud or stirring. It was hoarse, carrying the hesitation of someone unaccustomed to speaking at length before a crowd. "Brothers," James began, then paused briefly. "I'm not used to calling you employees." A few people raised their heads a little higher. Some glances met. There was surprise there and curiosity. James took a deep breath, his gaze moving slowly across each face seated before him, faces that were deeply familiar, yet tonight appeared sharper under the yellow light. "Truth is, I'm not very good at talking," he continued, offering a faint smile as if to steady himself. "But tonight, if I don't say anything, I'll feel like I owe all of you something." The space remained quiet, but the tension was gone. This was the silence of people ready to listen. James lightly clenched his hands together, as if trying to keep his voice from trembling. "There were times," he said slowly, "when this workshop almost couldn't survive. I know, you all remember. Orders were scarce, machines kept breaking down, and money was always short. There were nights when I stayed here alone, staring at these piles of wood, not knowing what the next day would bring. Someone near the far end of the table nodded slightly. Another lifted a beer to his lips, hiding eyes that were beginning to redden. James lowered his head for a moment, then looked up again, his voice deeper. "I'll be honest," he went on. "There were moments when I doubted myself. I wondered if I was leading everyone down the wrong path. Sometimes I thought maybe I should stop so you could all go find something more stable elsewhere." A pause spread through the room. No one spoke, but everyone understood that feeling. The days waiting for wages, the mornings of going to work unsure whether there would still be work to do by nightfall. James shook his head lightly, as if rejecting those old thoughts. "But then I looked again," he said, "and I saw that you were still here. No one left. No one turned their back. You kept coming to the workshop, kept working, kept believing that things would get better." His voice softened, not from weakness, but because emotion had risen too close to his throat. "This workshop," James continued, "it doesn't exist because of money. If it were about money, it would have shut down a long time ago. It exists because of the people here, because you didn't give up." At the center of the table, an older man set his glass down and exhaled slowly. He looked at James, his eyes deep and steady. "I've worked in a few places," he said, his voice calm but clear. "When things got hard, they let people go immediately. Here, at least we're still sitting together." James turned toward him and nodded, a wordless gesture of thanks. He took another deep breath, then spoke the sentence he had likely carried with him for a long time. "I'm not rich, and I'm not powerful," James said, slowly, each word deliberate, "but I'm proud to work alongside all of you." No one applauded. There were no cheers, only a few quiet nods, a few restrained smiles trying to hide the swell of emotion. One person turned away, pretending to reach for another beer. Another lowered his head, his shoulders trembling briefly before settling again. The silence now was no longer one of waiting, it was one of respect, heavy yet warm. James stood there looking around, clearly feeling the breath of the workshop, the presence of the people before him. He didn't sit down, he didn't add anything more. He simply let the moment settle, as if this evening still held something unsaid, and everyone understood that the story was not finished yet. James said nothing more. After a few seconds of letting the silence settle, he bent down and reached for a glass of beer placed near the leg of the table. The glass wasn't full. The foam had already subsided, looking exactly like the glasses held by everyone seated around him. He lifted it and began walking slowly along the length of the wooden table, not standing in one spot, not raising the glass high as part of any ritual. He stopped in front of each person, gently clinked glasses, met their eyes directly, and gave a small nod, an individual gesture of thanks, leaving no one out. Some people grew slightly awkward when James approached, half standing in reflex before sitting back down, smiling sheepishly. Others simply raised their glasses and tapped his very lightly, as if afraid of shattering the moment that had just passed. James didn't rush, and he didn't press anyone. He moved from one end of the table to the other, from the quieter younger workers to the older ones who had been with the workshop since the earliest days. With every clink, he paused for a brief beat, long enough for the person across from him to feel that they weren't just a name on a list, but a person remembered. When James stopped in front of an older worker with graying hair, the man looked at him longer than the others had. He raised his glass, clinked it softly, then spoke in a low but steady voice. "You remind me of myself when I was young, but you're different too." James smiled faintly, about to respond, but the man continued. "I used to work for Mr. Juan," he said. No explanation was needed, everyone understood. He was good at business, but he always looked at us like screws in a machine. Broken ones got replaced. A few people around the table nodded quietly. The name was familiar to them all. James stood still, listening, not interrupting. The older worker took a breath, his expression softening. "You're different. You don't talk much, but you know how to look at people. You know how to remember." Another man, also seasoned by years in the trade, cut in with a light-hearted tone to ease the weight of the moment. "At least this kid here actually pours us beer," he said with a crooked grin. "Back in Mr. Hawn's day, all he cared about was output." Scattered laughter rippled around the table, not loud, but enough to loosen the air. James lowered his head slightly, a bit embarrassed, but he didn't shy away. He clinked glasses with the man who had spoken, then continued on. In the middle of the table, a younger worker suddenly stood up, holding a beer glass already more than half empty. He hesitated for a few seconds, then spoke, his words not perfectly smooth but firm. "Honestly, we don't need a lot of words," he said. "As long as you don't abandon this workshop, we won't abandon you." The sentence wasn't shouted, wasn't delivered with fanfare, but the moment it landed, something seemed to burst open in the air. Laughter broke out more clearly. A few people nudged each other's shoulders. Some raised their glasses higher. Clinking sounds came in quick succession, glass meeting glass, mixed with rough laughter fueled by beer. James found himself pulled back toward the center of the table without quite realizing it, his glass repeatedly meeting others, from one person to the next. Another older man laughed as he spoke, his voice half joking, half sincere. "That's what leadership looks like. You don't have to say much, but when things get hard, you stand in the same line." He glanced briefly at James. "That your father didn't have." James heard the comment but didn't react right away. He simply clinked another glass, then another. The invisible distance between owner and workers dissolved with each sound of glass touching glass. The workshop was no longer a place of labor. It felt like a large room filled with voices, the smell of beer, grilled meat, and a rare, genuine warmth. James stood among them, not above, not apart, letting the moment spread on its own, as if the night itself was still unfolding, holding more unsaid truths yet to come. The sound of clinking glasses gradually faded, giving way to softer noises. In one corner of the workshop, someone turned on a small speaker brought from home. A slow, acoustic guitar melody drifted through the space. No one knew the name of the song, just a few familiar chords, enough to fill the gap left after the laughter. The music didn't silence people. Instead, it slowed the conversations, softened them. Voices dropped lower, becoming exchanges just loud enough to hear, just private enough to belong to those speaking. People kept eating and drinking, more at ease than before. No one was watching their manners anymore or glancing around to see where James was. A few workers took off their gloves entirely, setting them aside and grabbing grilled meat with bare hands. Someone leaned back against a wooden pillar, eating while listening to another talk about family, about children, about small plans after work. The laughter now didn't burst out in loud waves, but spread evenly through the workshop, like a living background sound. James sat down among them on a low wooden chair without a backrest. No one offered him a seat, and no one stood up when he sat. He pulled the chair in himself, poured more beer for himself, just like anyone else at the table. At times, he leaned in to listen to an older worker talk about his early days in the trade. At other times, he turned and smiled at a younger man showing photos of his newborn child. James didn't speak much, but the tension in his eyes was gone. Here, among these people, he didn't need to play the role of the boss, didn't need to calculate or brace himself. He was simply James. Someone who had gone through enough hard days with them to understand the value of being present. The guitar melody continued, steady and unhurried. Yellow lights from the workshop ceiling spilled downward, stretching long shadows across the concrete floor. Sawdust still scattered across the ground glimmered faintly when someone walked through it. Calloused hands lifted glasses and clinked them gently together, not for promises or declarations anymore, but for the simple pleasure of sitting together after a long day. At one corner of the table, two older workers clinked glasses and chuckled softly. "Been in this trade a long time," one said, "and moments like this are rare." The other nodded, his eyes drifting briefly toward James, sitting among the crowd. "Yeah," he said, "rare indeed." James looked around the workshop. The stacks of wood along the walls, The old machines, the scuff marks on the concrete floor. Everything was so familiar that he had stopped noticing it. But now, under the yellow lights and the sound of the acoustic guitar, it all felt different. It was no longer just a place for work and wages, but a space filled with memories, with people, with invisible bonds quietly taking shape. He looked at the faces around him. No one was perfect. No one lived an easy life. Yet everyone appeared simple and real. A sense of calm slowly spread through James's chest, a feeling he had rarely known before. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about tomorrow's orders or the numbers running through his head. Instead, he realized that what he was building wasn't just a workshop that could survive, but a collective that could sit together, laugh together, and trust one another. The music kept playing, the lights stayed on, the stories continued to unfold. And James sat there, quietly committing each moment to memory, as if he already knew that some evenings, though neither loud nor grand, would linger for a very long time in the hearts of those who had created them together. After a long workday, James quietly gathers his workers inside the woodworking shop for a simple dinner. Under warm yellow lights, tired faces slowly relax as shared food and small conversations bring back memories of the hardest days, when the workshop nearly collapsed. James doesn't stand above them as a boss. He serves food, pours drinks, and finally speaks honestly, calling them brothers, admitting his doubts, and acknowledging that the workshop survives not because of money, but because none of them gave up. There are no loud cheers, only silent respect, nods, and red eyes. As James clinks glasses with every worker, older men compare him to his father and see a different kind of leader, one who values people over profit. Music fills the space, laughter returns, and James realizes that what he has truly built is not just a workshop, but a family forged through resilience and trust.